Let's open with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the goodness of the day that you've given us. And as we turn towards evening, Lord, we thank you that Christy Mesaros-Winckles, Lord Jesus, is going to bring us into a presentation about women, Lord Jesus. And we're looking forward to seeing what she has to say about women who've been silenced and helping us to understand who these women were in the Free Methodist Church and what they've done. And we look forward to her presentation. We ask your blessings to be upon her and upon our team and upon everyone who's joining us this evening. May your will be done and your kingdom come. In your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. I'd just like to welcome you this evening and to the Advocates for Women in Leadership for the Free Methodist Church event, where we have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Christy Mesaros-Winckles share some stories of our past from her studies and research on her book, Silence: The Forgotten Stories of Progressive Era Free Methodist Women. I'd like to express our gratitude to Dr. Winckles for joining us this evening, and this event will be recorded. Please note the chat feature on your Zoom because we will be using that feature. If you have a question you want to ask Dr. Winckles, please type your question into the chat, and Katie Swati Hall will be monitoring the chat, and that we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the time after she finishes speaking. And in a few moments, you'll hear from Reverend Roberta Mosier-Peterson, who'll tell us a little more about AWL. And then Jill Richardson is going to introduce our speaker. You will be muted during the entire event while Dr. Winckles is speaking. Once again, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat feature. Over to you, Roberta.
Thanks, Denise. Advocates for Free Methodist Women in Leadership is a group of women leaders in the Free Methodist Church who are passionate about creating a culture of equality, opportunity, and safety for women in our churches. We're here to provide everyone in the FMC with resources to understand our theology and practice regarding equality of women in the kingdom of God in value, role, and function. We're also here to offer a safe space for women to tell their stories of church experience. This site is curated to assure that stories can be told with authenticity and without fear. We hope all can learn from your experiences. A couple of things that we're doing currently is we're promoting and presenting opportunity for women to be in the pulpit 4 times a year, at least in our churches. We're through the Preacher Sunday. The 2 that are coming up are September the 1st and December the 1st. A couple of ways you could help us with that is maybe you're in a church that isn't facing a problem with having women in the pulpit. A lot of you preach every Sunday, so good for you, but we still have a lot of conferences and a lot of churches that very rarely see women in the pulpit. So if you see our posts, if you could please share those broadly and just by word of mouth, share them with your ministry colleagues. That would be really incredible. We have a really great website that includes lots of different resources. Please go there. And if you have something that you like on that page, I would encourage you to send it to people and share it broadly. Another thing I'll mention, and then I'll hush so our speaker can talk, is that we'll have another web event on October 7th. And the topic for that will be having difficult conversations in the church. And it will feature the Reverend Dr. Amelia Cleveland Traylor. Thanks.
Okay. Dr. Christy Mesaros-Winckles, we're excited to have her. She's the keeper of the Free Methodist Feminist blog, and I ask you who does not love that already. The blog is devoted to sharing current studies and opinions about biblical feminism, as well as historical overviews of early women evangelists and Christian trailblazers. Dr. Mesaros-Winckles is an associate professor in communications And her specialization is, of course, in gender issues in evangelical Christian culture, the Christian patriarchy movement, and 19th century women's contributions to evangelical ministry. She is, as you've heard, the author of Silenced, The Forgotten Stories of Progressive Era Free Methodist Women. That's narratives that focus on the challenges faced by women who have been marginalized and oppressed or treated as secondary in the context of their faith. The book and her speaking schedule are available on her site, freemethodistfeminist.com. So I turn it over to her capable hands.
All right, let me just share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to try to put this into presentation mode. If people can't see it, let me know. Okay, it looks like it should be working. Just wave your hands if you see it. All right. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. I want to give a shout out before I start to Roberta Mosher-Peterson, who is here in her research, which I cite quite a bit at my conclusion, along with Christina Lascelles-Peterson's research, to kind of bring full circle some of the historic things that I'm researching in more 19th century culture with women in ministry, and then kind of bring to why we still have issues today. So what I want to do tonight is kind of walk through the history of women's ministry, particularly ordination, in the Free Methodist Church, and just share some of the stories from the book. A few of the slides at the beginning, I'll probably skip over, not a lot. I figure most people here have gone through Free Methodist history at some level, so you know that the denomination was founded on 4 freedoms. And Benjamin Titus Roberts and other early Free Methodists were very passionate about this. This led to their break from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1860. But one of the things that I like it to really emphasize, and one of the reasons I care about these issues, is I feel history is often written by the victor. And too often, even in Free Methodist histories, the early women who were also very influential in the denomination weren't really given the credit they deserved, besides Ellen Roberts, who totally, I feel, especially with Howard Snyder's book, got some credit. And so it's one of the things I kind of want to rectify. So I noticed when I was over at the new headquarters about a year ago that even if you go over and you look at the history section, they mentioned early on that they've always been supportive of women's ordination. Roberts was always supportive of women's ordination, but as I'll kind of talk a little bit about in this presentation, he did not have universal support for that, which was one of the major reasons that ordination really didn't happen until 1974, because there was always dissent, always differing opinions. And so that was one of the things I've really tried to research and understand is, if we all believe the same theological principles, why are we disagreeing on things as fundamental as biblical equality and women's roles within the denomination? So largely what my book is focusing on is not only just the history of women's ordination, but also trying to put what was happening in Free Methodism in the context of broader progressive era history in the United States, because the decisions Free Methodist leaders were making wasn't happening in a vacuum. Especially Roberts and his concerns with women's ordination, he tied those to suffrage and to not only equality in the pulpit, equality in marriage, equality in the workplace. And then we had a lot of changes happening as well, where women were, for the first time, late 1800s, able to really work outside the home. The suffrage movement, I think, was a big kind of push to women saying, hey, you know what? I feel called to ministry. I want to do more than just be an evangelist. I want to be equal to my male colleagues. And women who were working in Free Methodism or really other kind of holiness traditions, they didn't just preach, they were also social activists. Many of them were involved in the WCTU. They were very passionate about prohibition. Some of them also would write about suffrage. And they saw what they were doing as kind of a holistic ministry that was really all-encompassing all areas of their lives. What these women did is just remarkable. So I began this research well over 10 years ago when I was working on my doctorate at Bowling Green, and I just came across a short little history of 1890, 1894 Free Methodist General Conference. And I wondered who these women were who were recorded as giving speeches: Claire Weatherald in 1890 and Ida Gage in 1894. But no one could tell me anything. I asked Howard. Howard had a little bit of a footnote with Clara Weatherald. No one knew Ida Gage. And so that kind of started me on a quest where I went to Marston a lot. And I wanted to know who these women were because they were so passionate about ministry and about being able to do what they felt called to do and be ordained. And I just really connected to that. And so that's what's led me into this book. And through the process, I discovered even more remarkable women. And so I'll come back to this concept at the end, but I think one of the things to keep in mind is when we look at the women's stories, we look at their contributions, and then we wonder, well, why weren't they able to get everyone on board with ordaining them? This is kind of when we come from a comm perspective, I talk about this in the book too. Organizational culture doesn't happen in a vacuum. Free Methodists, like anybody, even today, we don't read just Free Methodist literature. We are reading a variety of Christian periodicals, even more general news sources, and all those things inform our opinions. And I really strongly believe that that was one of the main reasons Roberts had a lot of opposition, especially from his colleagues, was they were kind of getting other ideas, complementarianism. They were reading all these different things that were kind of fueling their belief that women should stay in the domestic sphere. And we still see a lot of that today, even in Christian publishing. And so once individuals have accepted a mindset of how a group should behave, what is a cultural norm, mandate, etc., it's really hard to shift. And that's one of the other reasons I think it took till 1974, is even if you have multi-generations, those ideas are now entrenched in organizational culture. And Roberts, unfortunately, passed away about 1893. And so it was right in the middle, really, of them debating women's ordination, bringing it back in 1894. I don't know if he lived longer, if it would have happened earlier, but it's really interesting to consider kind of the changing generational shifts in the denomination, and maybe how that as well led to taking so long. And so we start to look at questions that I was asking. I really was concerned with not only what did people read, maybe that were influenced them, but what was presented in the Free Methodist, what is now Light and Life for readers. And the Free Methodists published more than just Free Methodist articles. They published articles from a variety of religious periodicals. It was really interesting. You would never have really one perspective in that. And I talk about that in the book. There were people who were pro-ordination, people who were anti-ordination, and both of them got equal time, some years more so than others for one side. And so that also, when you're reading and seeing different discussions, that has an impact. As well as we look at the General Conference dailies, which was a really cool little publication that came out once every 4 years and record the debates at General Conference. And these were really, really important, trying to understand why people had the perspectives they did on women's roles in the church, because you could literally see what they were saying on the floor. I wish we still did that for General Conference, but recording the speeches of all the delegates on the floor is something that's gone by the wayside. So looking at kind of the whole time frame of what happened when, we have the Free Methodist denomination founded 1860. About 18 years later, 1878, women can be licensed as evangelists. That's great. They are desperately needed. There are not enough men who are able to or want to be ordained as elders. And so women began to fill the circuits and to actually help. More than just at a periodic revival service, they're doing the job of a local preacher. 1886, not only can they be an evangelist, but they can now be a delegate for their quarterly annual, even general conference. And so 1890 is the first conference that has women delegates. One was Claire Weatherald from East Michigan. The other was Anna Grant, who was from the Northern Indiana conference. And both of them voted in favor of women's ordination, which was debated and discussed. However, they couldn't reach a decision, a long story short, and they sent it back to annual conferences. And so next 4 years later, there were a few more women delegates. This time they all didn't vote in favor of ordination, but Ida Gage was one of them who was there from Ohio, and Ida did vote in favor of it. So unfortunately, 1894, ordination for women is defeated, but that's not the end of the discussion. This discussion on women's roles in the church and women, should they be ordained, what jobs, what can we allow them to do? This was really something that came up again and again and again until probably about 1917. And so you can see as well, like 1907, they approved the deaconess order, which I'll talk about a little bit. That was an ordination, but it was a designated ministry category for women, focused a lot more on probably like what you think of as Stephen minister today, a lot of service, nursing, pastoral care and support. 1911, they did allow women to be ordained as a deacon. But that was about it. And it was a complicated decision, which I'll talk about towards the end. 1974, finally, they're allowed to be ordained as an elder. So it's a really long time period. And a few highlights that I want to go through is kind of starting in the 1880s, when women are now able to be licensed evangelists. They're beginning to have discussions in the Free Methodist about women's roles. And there's some great articles that are published that are just beautiful. One was by Emma Silly Roberts, who was B.T. Roberts' daughter-in-law, one of the principals at July Seminary. She wrote an article right before the 1890 General Conference called Help It On, urging Free Methodists to be supportive of the debates for women's ordination at the conference that were going to happen. And as she notes, women are already filling the pulpits, but they don't have the support they need. And what she's talking about is the fact that as an evangelist, you did not have a guaranteed salary like an elder. You were really dependent on donations, and there wasn't a steady source of income. Additionally, you couldn't get discounts to travel by rail. That was only available to elders. Claire Weatherall noted this at 1890 conference. And so there were little fringe benefits too that women who were serving as evangelists could not get. And as Emma is saying, women are wanting to do this, but they really are disheartened. They feel they need the church to show that they support them. And then 1890 General Conference comes, and Anna Grant doesn't speak at the conference, or nothing is recorded of her speaking. But Claire's speech is recorded. And Claire was actually also asked to be one of the evening preachers for the 1890 conference. This is incredibly rare. You see very few women really over the next probably 40, 50 years. When you look at the General Conference dailies, there's not a lot of women who are preaching. And so looking at Claire Weatherall, not only was she a woman evangelist in East Michigan, she was also a friend and colleague of Roberts. There are articles in the Free Methodist where she actually goes up to July Seminary, meets and talks to Benson and Emma, helps with the revival because BT can't be there till the end. And so there's clearly a connection. And I found letters too that she's written where she's been asked to preach at funerals for various Free Methodists, and she sends him back a report. And so she was really, I feel, set up by B.T. Roberts to kind of serve as an example of a successful woman in ministry. She was married at the time to another Free Methodist, John Weatherall, who was also an ordained elder in East Michigan. And by 1890, as she notes at the conference, she's been preaching for 24 years. She started her career in the Methodist Protestant denomination in Michigan. And through Robert's cousin, Scepter Roberts, she actually was convinced to leave the Methodist Protestant Church, and her and John became Free Methodists very early on. And so she notes here the concerns that she has. She's a really powerful speaker. There's no mention, interestingly, of men responding directly to what she says. It's kind of like she's talking in a vacuum, and they hear her, maybe they're uncomfortable, I imagine, and they don't respond. But even though Anna Grant didn't talk, she was also a really powerful example who was there in 1890. And she was one of the women I researched, especially when I started on this book, because I didn't know anything about her. And her story is remarkable. So Anna was not only an evangelist, she was a doctor. Her family has stories of her practicing medicine in Indiana and a little bit probably in Iowa. She was married to John Wetherald, who was not a minister. He was more farmer, businessman, but he was incredibly supportive of her work. And even early on, when she had 3 or 4 children, she said to him that she felt called by God to go to have medical training. And he said, fine. And he stayed behind and watched the kids on the farm, and she completed medical training. She then became an evangelist as well. And she kind of, in her reports, would combine the two. She'd travel and preach. She'd also travel and do medicine. And it's unusual for the time period, too, to have a woman doing these things. Her stories are also really dynamic. All these women have very spirit-filled accounts. This was one from when she was early in her career. She largely didn't do circuit work, but she helped with revival services and travel and do revivals. Her family moved from Indiana to Iowa, eventually to Oklahoma. And everywhere they traveled, they were kind of called Free Methodist kind of trailblazers, pioneers, because they would go and set up revival services, ministry, connections for the Free Methodists where they went. Eventually, she ended up in Southern California. And so just a few interesting things, as I've kind of said about her. Her stories about her, especially as a doctor, come largely from her youngest son, Vivian Grant, who became a doctor because his mother's inspiration. But she faced resistance not only as a evangelist, and wanted ordination, couldn't get it, but she also faced resistance as a doctor. So much so that she resigned from being a doctor and continued being an evangelist really large until her death. She was constantly kind of facing opposition on all these fronts. So it's a remarkable woman who on 2 fronts was really pushing boundaries on women's roles. This one I love. Towards the end of her career, she's out in California and they need someone to be the pastor of the San Diego church. This is one of the few places she actually was the lead pastor. It even got local news coverage from a San Diego newspaper that noted she was making very little money and her children were subsidizing her and John in retirement so she could be the pastor of this church. But this was one of the reports she sent in of a days-long revival service that was being held at her church. And she mentioned as well at the time the Catholics had come out against them, but they were able to, I think, convert a couple Catholics, which was a big deal at the time. So it's just these vibrant languages. So as we see 1890, these 2 great women are there. Clara speaks. You know, what was the vote? We know it was defeated, but how close was it? By 2 votes. 40 opposed it, 38 in favor. And so because there was no consensus, it went back to annual conferences for debate and discussion for another 4 years. In the meantime, we have a lot of different things in Q&A time. If people want to ask me more of the soap opera stories about Claire Weatherald and Ida Gage, happy to share that, but I figured I'd save that. They both had very interesting lives and were married several times to keep it short. But Ida Gage is kind of emerging between 1890 and 1894 as a force to be reckoned with in the Ohio Conference. She actually started her ministry in Michigan, but was recruited to come down to Ohio, and she's going around and she's doing a lot of church planting work. And she is all over the place between 1890 and 1894. And this little speech I have here is what she actually said at the 1894 conference. And I just love kind of the folksy wisdom that she has here, talking about God sending blessings of salvation floating down her way. She's saved. She goes into ministry. Her daughter records different stories of her mother's experience, which is how I have so much, especially on Ida. And she talks about an account when the family, I think, was in Bowling Green, Ohio, where you can see here that Ida has lace on her collar, and she was actually condemned by a few of her parishioners for being too worldly in how she dressed. And her daughter says she didn't care. She still kept wearing the lace on her collar. That's the type of woman that Ida was. So we can see this is her really from about 1890 through about 1900. These are all the different places in Ohio that she was at. And And then this is kind of the way that she would talk through her different ministry reports that she would send in. Like Anna, her husband was not a pastor. He was just kind of a local handyman, found work wherever she was looked at. And really, he traveled with her, and where she needed to go, he went. So that was another example of kind of a unique marriage of the time period. So 1894 comes. Ida votes in favor of it. Another woman who is a lay delegate from Wabash votes in favor of it. A few other women, some who are even evangelists, vote against it, which is really interesting to me. And so this time there's a lot more opposition. They don't all vote the same way as their annual conference, but annual conferences as well were very divided on this topic. And so the final vote on the floor from delegates was 65 opposed, a lot more this time than 1890, 35 in favor. And so people said, the issue's dead. We've resolved it. But they really didn't, because the issue of what can we let women do didn't go away. Women kept pushing for their right to fulfill their calling. And by 1910, when you look at all the evangelists, which are in Free Methodism, 81% of them were women. And so that's showing that even after, and actually the number of women licensed as evangelists exploded after the defeat in 1894. I don't really know why, but it took off. And I think if you look at that number, that potentially was also why it was defeated, because you have so many more women in visible ministry positions after those two general conferences. And during those conferences, they were a lot fewer women. And if you don't see people who look like you and come from similar backgrounds to you, you don't recognize or understand kind of the value of voting and supporting their rights and calling. But what's interesting is, even though 81% of licensed women are evangelists, we start to see, though, that they're still not being regularly appointed. Quite a bit of what they do is just helping, assisting, leading revivals. Only 15% of them are getting regular appointments. And this data here has come from, I went through all the annual conference minutes from the first year that women were allowed to be evangelists and through about the end of the progressive era, which is about 1920. And I literally wrote down the name of every single woman I found. And so that was an entire summer project. But there was no information on women and the number of women in ministry. And I felt like that was essential to really understand this history. At the time, I wished I'd had a research assistant, but I didn't have one, so I did it. But 1907 comes. The issue really isn't dead. Instead of, though, giving women ordination, they kind of throw them a bone, and they develop what's called the Free Methodist Deaconess Order, which I think is a forgotten piece of Free Methodist history. This was actually becoming common. The Methodist Episcopal Church had a deaconess order by this time. A lot of Protestant denominations were becoming concerned with rising immigrant population in cities. This was right at the time of kind of social gospel concerns, rescue houses, missions, trying to help the poor in whatever way possible. And so Free Methodists didn't want to get left behind. They wanted to have some way to be able to really organize and do social ministry. And so a deaconess order seemed a logical choice. And there were some women who were advocating for it. And so they approved a deaconess order in 1907. What was interesting, though, was they tried to group the women evangelists, with the deaconesses. And when they were approving the deaconess order, they tried to institute as well a more stricter, especially dress code for women evangelists that it didn't fly, never took off. But I find it interesting that they almost were trying to group them into this category. But this was a very different type of ministry, whereas evangelists preached. Deaconess wasn't a preacher. They were very much nursing, visitation, working in rescue homes and missions. It was a much more strenuous process to become a deaconess, too, than it was to become a licensed evangelist. As you can see over here, it was a 2-year course of study, and then they had an exam afterwards. And honestly, the training, I think, limited the number of women who began to seek it. And so we see that because, it takes 2 years to do the training, it really wasn't until 1910 that there even was deaconesses beginning to appear. Annual conferences oversaw their own kind of deaconess orders. And depending on your annual conference, you might have a very vibrant deaconess order, or you might not have really anything. It really varied widely. Oil City in Pennsylvania had a really strong presence, as well as I know we have a few people here from Oklahoma. Oklahoma as well had a really vibrant group of deaconesses who were working. But even by 1912, there were only about 11 women deaconesses. And so if you look at the comparisons here, you can see the red is the deaconesses, and the blue is evangelists. And that order doesn't grow at the same rate that we see the number of evangelists, potentially because the training was harder. But there were also other issues, I think, that made this not take off like some people thought it would. Only one college, Evansville Junior College in Wisconsin, offered deaconess training. And some of the deaconesses about 5 years in were encouraging other colleges to offer the training, but it really didn't happen. So that also required a little bit of, financial means to be able to go and do that training. Oversight was very much by the annual conference. And support would vary. Some conferences, as I said, were supportive, others were not. It also used a mentorship model. So if you wanted to be a deaconess and you were in a conference that didn't have other deaconesses, it was really hard to get started because you didn't have that woman to kind of mentor, go and follow and see what she was doing, help with your training, licensing exam, things like that. But a few examples of things that they did were Redeeming Love in Oklahoma. And this is a picture from one of the books. That's actually a really cool history of it. One of the only histories of the Women's Free Methodist Deaconess Order. But Lifeline Mission, I talk about in my book as well. Wichita Rescue Home in Kansas. Even the Jerry Homes in New York had deaconesses who would work there. But you can see it was very much rescue kind of home focused on various types of kind of more social service care. The one thing that I only focus one chapter on the deaconesses, and if anybody's interested, it's definitely an area, I think, of history that people need to explore more because there are so many women there. One of the roadblocks as well is it's just really hard to find information on them. They're so scattered. That was a big challenge. But 1907, deaconess order. And then they decide, okay, well, 1911, let's offer ordination, but limited ordination finally to women. And this is ordination as a deacon. And so 1911, General Conference approves ordination as a deacon. This now allowed women to marry, baptize, serve communion, things they could not do as an evangelist. They would have to wait for a ordained male elder to come if they were staffing and serving a church. And this was really problematic. Leading up to 1911, just like leading up to the 1890 conference, women evangelists wrote in and male supporters wrote into the Free Methodist talking about all the hardships they were facing, saying, you have to provide ordination in some form to us. We literally cannot do our job of serving our community if you don't give us ordination rights. And so we see by 1913, these women were the first women who were ordained as deacons. We had Laura Lamb, who was from Pennsylvania. Ada Hall was from North Iowa and Minnesota. Anna Bright was a Wabash area. And then we had Bertha Green and Minnie Beers. And I cannot remember, but I can't remember where those two were from. And I talk about all of them in a chapter on it, but one of my favorites that I just wanted to highlight was Ada Hall. I love Ada. She was also another really dynamic person. And what I found interesting was once women were ordained as a deacon, they took up the title reverend, and even local newspapers would call them reverend, say Reverend Ada Hall is coming to speak at the church. And so it put them, even though it didn't give them access to senior leadership positions like being a bishop or being in charge of an annual conference, from at least a serving in church perspective and ministry, it did put them on more equal footing. But The denomination really didn't have any intent to give women ordination as elder. And at this point, ordination as deacon came with a caveat saying, if you are ordained as a woman deacon, this is by no means to say that you are then going to become an elder. You can't, essentially. And so what happened then was those very senior leadership positions in the denomination weren't available for till 1974 to women, which I think is why we've seen only recently women bishops elected in the Free Methodist Church. It's taken a lot of time to rectify that. So Ada Hall was, this is a piece that she wrote, kind of urging Free Methodists to allow women to be ordained. You can see here how, once again, how she is very, very outspoken about this. She preached all over. She as well ended up in California towards the end of her career, and really preached her entire life. But what was interesting was, once again, just it goes up and down, this whole women's role and ordination, what purpose, what do we give them, etc. So it wasn't dead. 1915 General Conference came, and the denomination suddenly realized, oh, wait, we have couples who've been serving together in ministry. And if we ordain the wife as a deacon and her husband's already an ordained elder, then we have to give them more retirement funding. We can't afford that. At least that was the excuse. And so they backtracked on women's ordination as deacon in 1915. And so if you were married to an ordained elder, you could not become an ordained deacon. And it was contentious. They kind of grandfathered in a few women who they'd already allowed to become a deacon, but they wouldn't allow anymore. And this was something that really was problematic. One of the things I found in Light of Life articles advocating for ordination as elder in 1974, they would talk about this, that some of the women who were waiting to be ordained as elders had literally been working side by side with their spouse, essentially as a minister, but they couldn't even be a deacon because their spouse was already ordained. And so this was one of the reasons that they were pushing in 74, not the only reason, but one of them. And so finally, 1974 comes, it really passes unanimously. All the delegates in General Conference approve ordination, and very soon after General Conference ends, we have the first two women ordained as elders, Jean Perry in July 19th and Ina Ellis in August. And between 1974 and 1978, 19 women were ordained. But as I said kind of a few slides ago, I think the loss of momentum with all kind of going back and forth, not giving women ordination as elder earlier, it kind of made it difficult for women to want to pursue those senior leadership roles if they didn't have visible examples. And so by 1997, if you started to look at statistics, only 16% of Free Methodist pastors, senior pastors in particular, were women. By 2011, which is the final year I have for data, it really had only increased a tiny bit. And so that leads kind of to, where is the church today? And when we look at where we are, just overarching kind of Protestant American culture, about 3% of churches are led by women in a senior pastoral role. That's not great. Free Methodism, doing better. And I think this number is much higher, but unless the numbers have been there, last I heard, people are still trying to collect this data. But about 17%, and this would be senior pastor positions. This is not just any pastoral role. That was one of my big interests, was where, particularly if women are serving the church, are they serving at? And I think having women in the most senior positions matters. And so why is this an issue? This is something that I talk about in my conclusion, really cite a lot of the things Roberta has in her own research, but it comes back, I think, to the power of an idea. Not only was these ideas and different readings and periodicals really influential to people during Robert's era, but if you start to research Christian publishing now, there's a lot of things for more pop culture Christian content from a complementarian perspective than from an egalitarian perspective. And the average person isn't going to sit there and think, what's the theological background of this person I'm reading? They're just going to pick a book up because it's Christian, not realizing that it probably has a different perspective on gender roles than even the church they're going to. I don't have a solution for that, but until there is a way to kind of, I don't know, rectify, counterbalance that influence of pop culture, I think this is going to be an ongoing issue. So that's really where my research is currently looking at, is kind of trying to trace and understand the histories of mediated culture and its influence on gender, especially in regards to the holiness tradition. So I hope I haven't talked too fast. I want to definitely have time for questions. And I think I've stayed within my time. So I'll let Katie take over, and I'm happy to answer whatever I can.
All right. Thank you so much. I've had a couple questions come in so far in the chat, and if anyone thinks of questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat, and then I'll share them out loud. So the first question we had, and you may not know this because you said there's still kind of a lot of unknown data, even just around like how many lead pastors who are appointed now that are women, but a question has been asked, has the Free Methodist Church done a survey on what salaries women are receiving as elders, as senior pastors or lead pastors? Is there any sort of salary information out there to your knowledge?
Not that I know. I would love to also see data on how many we have who are minority or representing other groups too in senior pastoral roles in the Free Methodist Church. I grew up Free Methodist. I'm now Methodist Episcopal, and I find it interesting that the Methodist Church keeps that sort of data, but I think Free Methodism has to catch up a little bit with that. I know they care, but it's hard to collect it. It's really hard to get people to respond to surveys and get the information that, we need.
And then another question that I had was just about your sources. I'm curious to know, because you shared at the beginning that it was hard to, like, even asking around, people didn't know who some of these names were. I think you mentioned someone's letters. Like, where did you find information about these women?
So this is, my book is like, I feel a bunch of tiny little fragments. So some of the most important I found actually was doing genealogy research. Ancestry.com helpful in finding descendants. And I was fortunate that many of these women have actually really like diehard genealogists in their family who just had tons of info to share. And so the families themselves, big thank you to them. The Free Methodist Archive, it's a highly, I think, underutilized historic source. There is so much information just in I still am looking at that. You can read it. There's everything in those. So those sort of publications were really good. I relied a lot on primary sources. Marston, Spring Arbor University have great resources. I was at a lot. Howard Snyder's book, Populous Saints, is a must read for anyone. And then I did use Wilson Hogue, and especially Marston. Marston's book is very good too, Age to Age, Living Witness. But one thing, as I talk about in my book, I find Hogue especially to be very revisionist at times in his history. And he was one of the people who was not in favor of ordination. And so that needs to be, and so was E.P. Hart. He was not in favor of ordination. So two of the early histories were written by people not in favor of women's ordination and equality. So I think that needs to be kept in mind when looking at those as sources.
Another question asked was, are the ordained deacons and also consecrated deacons? Oh, sorry. I think the question is asking if the ordained deacons is different than consecrated deacons today, or if those are two distinct roles.
Someone else can probably answer that better. Anybody want to jump in?
I feel like Katrina Wilkins could maybe answer that because she oversees.
Yes, actually, ordained deacon in 1911 is the same as the ordination. There was a two-step ordination, ordained deacon to ordained elder, that was until the early 2000s. And so, yes, that was an ordination. Since then, even through there was a local deacon and those kinds of things. But now there's the consecrated deacon. We had that weird thing for 4 years that was a conference deacon, also not an ordination, also a lay position. So yeah, we just need different words.
Yeah.
Not confusing at all. All right, another question. Was there evidence that the opposition was centered around theological, cultural, or financial concerns?
So it depended on the time. 1890, 1894, it was theological, where they would be, what would happen was Roberts was using the original Greek, taking a more historical cultural interpretation of scripture, whereas the opponents to ordination were very literal and were only reading English. And so that was a massive issue. But you also had opponents quoting things like women should be in the home. Women's primary role is to nurture children, and that's their God-given thing. And that's the sort of things that were also appearing in pop culture at the time, especially by those who were opposed to suffrage. When you get more to 1915 with opposition to ordaining women deacons who also have a spouse who's an elder, that one, they said it was financial, but you would still, and this is why looking at the actual General Conference dailies and what people say, I think matter more than the vote itself. Because a lot of those same things about women's place in the home or very literal interpretation of scripture were playing in as well still with what the opposition was saying. And so I think that's really important. Another factor that I would mention is when we look at books that have been written by Free Methodists pro-ordination, Ordaining Women by Roberts, must read. I think it's incredibly undervalued as a feminist text, early suffrage text. It's brilliant. I talk about Walter Salou and his pamphlet book / Why Not? And I think people have largely read that as pro-women's ordination, but it's not. If you start to look at it, Salou was one of the people who was advocating for women's ordination as deacon, but stopping there. And he flat out says in his book that women have no desire to be ordained elders and are perfectly fine letting men serve in those senior leadership positions. And so it's really interesting. And then the fact that his wife becomes a deaconess. Yeah, there's stories there that people could explore.
Did you get a sense in your research why there was such a big shift in the voting between the 1890 and 1894 conferences?
Not really. So I argue that the editorialship of the Free Methodist does make a difference because Roberts was editor up to about 1890, and he did publish a lot of pro-ordination pieces. He published people against it, but he himself was probably the most in favor editor of ordination. So he pushed that in the conference, in the denomination periodical. But then after that, you had a variety of different editors, including Hogue, who was not in favor of ordination. And then Logan after him, who was in the early 1900s. And so I have a lot in my book about kind of the editorial impact and influence. And so I can't say 100% that was why, but I definitely think, if you're reading denominational publications and the person who's the main editor is in favor of ordination, that's probably going to kind of influence people's votes and perceptions.
What are some convictions you hold regarding women in ministry that have been shaped by this research? For example, any advice for the Free Methodist Church now?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I guess for me, education of just the general church member is so important because I've never been ordained. I was a local deacon for a while when I was at the Holland Free Methodist Church in Ohio. But I didn't know any of this history. I grew up Free Methodist. I didn't know any of this until I think I was at IYC one year when I was in college. And I heard Brenda Young talk about some of the early women evangelists in history. And I was like, whoa, there's really cool women here. And it just kind of stayed in my mind. And I loved history even when I wasn't doing research in it. And I just read things. And then Howard's book came out and I was like, whoa, I didn't know any of this either. And so I'm like, how did I become a member and grow up Free Methodist and not know any of this? And so I think for me, and this is why I keep a blog, it's just teaching people to research and to ask questions and to become even critical participants in their own denomination or their own Christian reading practices, I think has probably been the most influential things for me personally that I've gotten from this research.
In your research, did women leaders migrate out of the Free Methodist movement due to its failure to ordain women? And if so, any indication on the size of that migration? This person said, I'm curious if there's any data connecting the stagnation of the organizational growth to this particular issue.
I think they could be tied. I think Marston and a few others mentioned as well that especially when the denomination started to be focused early 1900s more on bureaucracy, policy, less on evangelism and expansion. And that was about the same time that women's roles were stagnating too. I don't have a lot of hard data, but Claire Weatherald is a great example of a woman that we lost, who we shouldn't have, who frankly should be like up there on the wall at headquarters with Roberts. This woman, Claire Weatherald, is totally overlooked and forgotten. I would fight to get her way more coverage in Free Methodist history. She left soon after 1890. And what she did was she wanted to be ordained. She'd been in ministry 20 years. She became a Congregationalist because they were ordaining women. And she joined the Congregationalist Church in Gaylord, Michigan, and was one of the first women in the United States ordained by a regional congregational council. Lucy Stone gave her a shout out in the women's column as, congrats to Clara for getting ordained. What made it hard to realize that this was Claire Weatherald, though, was Claire Weatherald was married 3 times in her life. And she was Clara Buell at the time she was ordained. And so she was in several histories, including Janet Hasse, who wrote a great book about women. But to connect her back to that Free Methodist woman took a little bit of work.
All right, so I shared the link to your blog, and I'll do that again. Are there any other places we can find you or
Yeah,
places to follow your work online?
Yeah, I need to blog more. I've been kind of buried in a few research papers I have to get out. But yeah, my email is on there. I would love if people have questions. I'm happy as well to share any of my sources if people are going on this themselves, including I've shared with a couple people already that massive spreadsheet I have of all the women over the decades, especially if people are trying to find maybe some of their own relatives, at least for about 1878 through about 1920. It makes it pretty easy to see who was where. So yeah, just shoot me an email. Happy to share information.
Thank you so much. I think
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
wrap us up. Thank you. Denise, I think you're still muted.
I guess I didn't realize I was. Thank you. We want to thank everyone for coming this evening. And for Dr. Winckles, you can purchase her book the way I did on Amazon. And she has it via Kindle ebook as well, which is great. And Roberta reminded you of our resource page. And we recommend you to visit our website, awlfmc.org, for more information. Next preacher Sunday is September 1, so be looking forward to hearing women in your pulpits. And again, October 7th is our next event with Dr. Amelia Cleveland Trailer. So we look forward to it. We hope you have a great evening. The Lord, thank you for a wonderful event tonight, and bless us all, Lord, as we leave this meeting. To your name be the glory. Amen.